Well, hello and welcome back to another Cal OSHA Quick Take with Conn, Maciel, Carey. I'm Scott Cuthbert, co-founder of Safepedia, and with me today is Rachel Conn and Megan Shackhead from Conn, Maciel, Carey. And today we're going to be talking about the annual Cal OSHA enforcement and regulatory updates. Are you ready for 2025? So the full webinar will be hosted by Conn, Maciel, Carey on Thursday, December 5th at 10 a.m. Pacific time and 1 p.m. Eastern. We'll have a registration link for that in the description below. And they're going to be covering the new Cal OSHA regulations, California legislation impact on workplace safety and health, significant Cal OSHA Standard Board decisions, and a lot more. But to provide a little bit of insight into what's going to be covered on the 5th, I will turn it over to Rachel and Megan.
Thank you, Scott. My name is Rachel Conn, and I'm chair of the California practice here at Conn, Maciel, Carey. And as Scott noted, we have our annual Cal OSHA enforcement and regulatory update coming up in a couple weeks. And as many of you know that have facilities or operate in California and are subject to Cal OSHA, it's perhaps one of the most aggressive and enforcement heavy approved state plans in the nation. So California employers certainly face a host of requirements that other employers in the country don't face, and that continues to be true. And we expect as we go into 2025 for that to continue to be true and continue to increase. Certainly with the change of administration at the federal level and the anticipated deregulation at the federal level, and probably a slowing down of some of OSHA's work there, California tends to take the opposite approach in situations like that. So we certainly saw that during COVID, and we anticipate that we're going to see something similar to that as we go into 2025, and not only 2025, the next 4 years. So this is certainly the time to take stock of the new regulations, anticipate what Cal OSHA's enforcement is like, and really prepare your workplace for that, for what is to come. So for enforcement, we are going to go over the latest enforcement trends, the areas that we see an uptick in, specific regulations that have been more of a focus for Cal OSHA, and we're seeing more inspections and citations around. It's no secret that Cal OSHA has struggled with vacancies at every level of the agency for many years. They still are struggling with that, but there has been a concerted push from the Department of Industrial Relations to really fill those spaces and to fill those voids. We've seen an uptick in the hiring of inspectors. We've seen new regional offices be formed. We've seen more inspectors and investigators at the Bureau of Investigation. So we certainly see a continued emphasis on enforcement and ramping up that as a priority as we go into 2025. And we'll also be talking about some of those regulations that recently went into effect that we anticipate will likely have enforcement priorities for Cal OSHA. So, of course, workplace violence prevention, SB 553, we'll have some updates on implementation and enforcement of that. And although we are entering the winter months, we finished off the summer with indoor heat, and we know that that will continue to be a special emphasis program for Cal OSHA and area. So now is the time to really get programs like that in order as we have a lull in the heat and heat waves and other heat triggers for that regulation. And with that, I'll turn it over to my partner Megan, who can talk about some of the additional regulatory updates and rulemaking that we'll be talking about and that we anticipate coming up in the new year.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Shaked, practice lead out in Conn, Maciel, Carey's San Francisco office, covering the whole state of California, along with Rachel. We want to make sure that employers, anyone else tuning into the webinar, have a clear sense of kind of what new regulations are already on the books. Hopefully, everyone is squared away with their workplace violence prevention programs, their indoor heat prevention programs. But again, here to make sure that in case any of those details slipped through as those regulations came to fruition, were worked on for some time, but when it came down to the wire, the implementation period was quite quick. So, want to make sure that folks understand what they have to comply with now. Some of the other kind of new regulations that came about that might impact folks depending on their industry is the expansion to the lead standards for both general industry and construction, as well as emergency regulations and working on the changes to the permanent regulation for silica. We want to point out where there is some good news for employers, some support, additional support that the agency is trying to put out in the form of written fact sheets and different materials, particularly for employers who may be impacted by avian flu. Those would be like agricultural dairy settings. The agency is trying to put together some resource materials for employers. And then on the lead side, they're working on putting out fact sheets and a model plan for those, because the changes to the lead standard were incredibly significant. We can't emphasize that enough. And so employers who are familiar with the standard may be in a better position to make changes, but those employers who are newly swept into coverage may be, not as familiar. And so we want to make sure folks are aware of that. And then we also want to make sure that folks know of things coming down the pipe potentially, because as we know, these rulemakings may take quite some time with the division, but then once they get passed with the standards board and an implementation, an effective date is there, sometimes that timeline is very quick. And we also want folks to be aware of things that may be in progress to the extent they might want to participate in the rulemaking process, make their voices heard to the standards board. There are opportunities to ask questions to clarify what the agency might be looking for. So some of the areas that are working through those rulemaking processes, both in kind of early stages in an informal rulemaking and formal rulemaking, are things like changes to the first aid kit requirement, the impact of some legislation that passed around opioid reversal medication, the availability of that on work sites, changes to workplace violence, because as we know, currently those requirements stem from California Labor Code, but the division, OSHA, is tasked with creating a regulation. So they're working through that process. There are some of the work that OSHA does to make changes to regulations stem from legislation that gets passed. So the California State Legislature might pass something that says, hey, OSHA, revisit your heat illness prevention plan and make sure that you're addressing this, that, or the other thing, or make sure that you are reviewing your wildfire smoke regulation, because we want you to check for the current impact on employers for some question that they have. So those are some of the things on OSHA's docket as well. And then we know, speaking of COVID, that non-emergency rule is set to begin to sunset in February 2025, with record keeping sunsetting in February of 2026. So we do know that, there will ultimately be a response to that, whether it's a change to the aerosol transmissible disease standard or some other change to address respirable, illnesses, and some way to address that for the longer term. So we'll, give folks lots to think about and hopefully some good things to prioritize on their to-do lists and available to answer any questions folks have.
Yeah, that's great. And I remember last year, this time, covering all the things that definitely unfolded in 2024 that the employers needed to be on top of. And again, sounds like if you're gonna, hopefully you attended all the Cal OSHA sessions throughout the year, but if you haven't, this is the one you definitely need to tune into on December 5th, again at 10 a.m. Pacific time or 1 p.m. Eastern. But it's going to be chock full of valuable information you're going to need to know moving forward. Well, thanks, Megan and Rachel, for joining today. I look forward to the full webinar on the 5th.
Thanks for having us, Scott.